Africa. So this narrative, talked about narrative. Narrative, I put it to you respectfully, sirs, is the weapon of warfare, not nuclear weapons, not other kinds of weapons, and I speak as somebody who has been at the cutting edge of weapon technology. They have failed to deliver success. But narratives, and they're being used incredibly skillfully by Western nations, are what's dominant. And isn't it time that you got this legitimate of exploitation out to the British, the European, American, and Canadian populations who mean well for you as a continent, who care about other human beings, and who don't want exploitation in their name?
Thank you very much indeed. We'll take question number 2.
Bonjour à l'Assemblée. Je suis le colonel Maurice Ndion, attaché militaire du Sénégal au Rwanda, avec résidence à Addis Abeba. Ma question s'adresse au président de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Monsieur le Président, je pense que nous convenons que les mécanismes de soutien à l'architecture africaine de paix et de sécurité, APSA, des acteurs extra-africains ont une importance stratégique, tant ils tendent à modifier les rapports de force entre les différents acteurs africains et extra-africains, institutionnels et étatiques. Par conséquent, mon inquiétude est de savoir si les enjeux sont bien compris de nos dirigeants, qui, pour le financement de l'extension de la phase 1 de la transition d'ADMIS, se sont tournés vers l'Union européenne pour obtenir 85 millions d'euros. D'ailleurs, c'est dans ce cadre qu'un chef d'État, lors de la conférence des États contributeurs de troupes, s'est offusqué en disant que, vraiment, pour trouver 85 millions de dollars, il était décevant que 54 pays africains se tournent vers l'Union européenne. De ce fait, ma question est la suivante. Quelles sont les raisons qui poussent les États africains à accepter une relation de dépendance vis-à-vis des acteurs exogènes en matière de gestion des crises? Et comment concilier cette dépendance, cette posture, à notre slogan qui veut bien dire solution africaine aux problèmes africains. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Sir, give us your name, please, again.
Colonel Maurice Ndion.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Let me take these 2, and then I'll come to my, the other 2 on this. So a couple of questions here. Brian, I believe you should handle the narratives. Prof, how do you distinguish those ones who come in peace and those ones who come otherwise? And then we'll also chip in, Minister, as we go along. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to be tempted, but I know PLO, you will handle this. Eduardo, most grateful to you, but as often happens in Pan-Africanist circles, I do not agree with the definition. And I'll tell you why, PLO, as a lawyer. You've heard me say this before. The intervention in Iraq was couched in very benign terms. The intervention in Libya was couched in benign terms. I could give you 100 interventions where the justification, objectively speaking, was on the basis that there was evidence either of genocide or evidence. I'm sitting in Rwanda. The international community stood by as the genocide against the Tutsi happened. Yet in the same year, they were intervening in West Africa. the construct of benign and malign is controlled and related to the question of narrative and strategic self-interest. We've often not paid enough attention, and thank you, Chairperson of the African Union, for educating us on how the international fora of decision-making, the Security Council, and other fora, including at some stage, how we transact within the International Criminal Court and other platforms. That evidence, and that was my point, we don't control data, we don't control digital platforms, we therefore are not controlling narrative in both analog and digital forms. What can practically be done? We do need to speak to Europeans, not as victims, because the erasure of the contribution in European consciousness of Africans to modernity and civility has constructed a white supremacist view that sees the evolution of modernity as a singularly European contribution. And it is only now that our young researchers are beginning to excavate the contributions of black people, of Africans, towards inventions. Because until now, the province of economy was not the province of black people. In my country, in Zimbabwe, when land was taken, a British court gave a judgment that said, the question before them and who owned the land, they said, one thing is certain, it cannot be the native because the native has no sense of ownership. It was on that basis that land was taken. Number two, on the question of economics, even we pejoratively only talk about our people as informal law, informal economy, yet the informal economy is formal. That's how India developed through its cottage industry. That's how we have a psychotic addiction to colonial definitions of what, and that's why Professor Ashraf is correct. It's not just a narrative about our contribution historically. It's a narrative about our contribution now. Our young people who developed M-Pesa, which is now being used globally, who developed Ushahidi, which has been used by over 300,000 organizations, including the Japanese, the US military, and the NATO forces, are never sufficiently credited. Why? Because it is not in the current psyche of most Europeans possible that Africans are anything else except the object of charity that deserve our mercy and our pity. Why? Because they are governed by tyrants, right? Or Africans are incapable of ethics. And we've constantly said that Switzerland, which received the Abacha loot, which received the loot from the then Zaire and now DRC, has constantly been ranked in anti-corruption indices as the cleanest country in the world. P.L.O. and I are lawyers. The receipt of stolen property is theft at law. How is it that you will have Nigeria and Kenya ranked so far, and yet the country that receives the money ranked so up? I think that if you're changing narrative, you also have to change behavior. Our African leaders and citizens constantly confirm the European caricature, an object of pity. When we come into these spaces, we can never transact revolution in courtesy. I like to be civil, to be courteous, right? But each time I start pointing to atrocities committed by African governments, the Europeans and the Americans cheer me up. Each time I refer to the historical atrocities and continuing atrocities committed first by governments and by companies that are dumping cyanide into our underground water and nuclear waste, right? You know what it is said? This is retrogressive. It's undermining investment. It's again, listen, we cannot win the narrative battle by arguing in pockets. They are happy us talking about our localized, indigenized oppression. They are never happy us talking about the question of distribution and redistribution of the global economy, of global power. And what Nkrumah and others realized in 1963 at the founding conference, if Africa is not represented, if Africa does not own its narrative, but you can't own your narrative if your leadership is totally disconnected from its people. You can't own your narrative if your intellectuals are totally disconnected. We have underinvested in rural areas and slums where the majority of our people are. In fact, we treat them as security threats and they are over-policed. Number two, we have underinvested in our academic and research institutions. We'd rather bring McKinsey and bring Deloitte and Touch. They will help us do AU reform. Why? Because there are no African consultancies that we know. Even if they exist, we have no relationship with them to help us with AU reforms, with anything else. And this is not a pronouncement on McKinsey or Deloitte. It's a pronouncement on ourselves. We have not, as a leadership, begun to recognize that the native is capable of knowledge. The native is capable of economy. The native is capable of invention. You can't change the narrative if the starting premise is we're trying to be like Europe and to catch up. We can't change the narrative when we're constantly trying to learn from others without understanding, and I'll end with that, what William Tunga said, the former Chief Justice of Kenya. He says, let's not engage in this romanticist view that there can only be one way to learn. We first must indigenize knowledge. That's what I said, learn from our culture and traditions. Number two, we must diversify who we learn from. We can not only learn from the West, we need to learn from everybody who has something to teach. Number three, we must domesticate what we learn. If we're going to learn anything, let's domesticate. I think the chairperson and the minister said it's consciousness. Narrative is first and foremost by realizing self-worth, self-belief, and looking inward so that when you look outward, it is to supplement not a vacuous state of nothingness and inferiority, but it is to supplement a very stable, solid foundation where your culture, where your values, where your value for people is important.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me respond to the good professor's question by reminding us that the continent of Africa has tried several times to define herself in order to confront and engage. In the area of trade as early as 1980 under the Lagos Plan of Action, Africa took the view that in order to go forward, we must have a master plan of how we are going to have enhanced intra-African trade and intra-African engagement. Of course, the Lagos Plan of Action came a cropper, and in many ways, Africa Agenda 2063 is a rehash of the Lagos Plan of Action. In other words, Africa recognizes the need to define herself and to define her agenda. And I do not begrudge nations that define themselves and their agenda. Ronald Reagan once said it, and I agreed with him, that every nation does what is in her best interest. And I have no problem with that. The problem that we have is that at critical moments in African history, we have failed to seize the moment. You will remember in 1917 at the Champaran campaign, Mahatma Gandhi told Charlie Andrews, I do not want you to participate because at this point in time, the Indians must believe that they can do it themselves. In other words, there comes a time in the history of a nation when even friends of goodwill must be told, keep aside. We want to believe that we can do it, and your help must be surreptitious and subterranean if you are a person of goodwill. And the Champaran philosophy is what we must define for ourselves. In the year 2005, the former Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, put together 17 individuals in what was then called Our Common Interest, the report on the African Commission. The Prime Minister, he was then the President of the European Union, from which Britain has now left, and he was also the President of the G8 at that time before the exclusion of Russia. They produced a report. Right now, when I see the Blair Institute moving around Africa, they are implementing exactly what was in that particular report, and I have a copy of it, not for the benefit of Africa, but for the benefit of the Institute. And what they have done is to sugarcoat it and camouflage it for the purpose of hoodwinking Africa and for the purposes of creating an environment which benefits foreign companies to the detriment of the continent of Africa. So that some of these engagements are anodinal. They simply lull us into a false sense of security. Do I blame them? No. That is why I agree that we must decolonize all learning. I don't know who said it this, that if you have that the happiness of the slave is the comfort of the slave owner. And I'm saying that if Africa does not recognize this, then Africa will never recognize and realize our potential. The saying goes that if you behave like grass, goats will eat you. And many times we in the African continent behave like grass, and we are fit for eating. And that is what I'm saying, going forward in a strategic engagement such as this, it is incumbent upon the continent of Africa, and remember I said there is a new scramble, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle. There was 1 month in this continent when the Russian foreign minister was here, the American foreign minister was here, the Chinese foreign minister was here, the French president was here, the Turkish president was here, within a period of 2 weeks. What were they looking for? What is in their best interest? They engaged little countries. They don't want to engage the East African community. They don't want to engage SADC. They don't want to engage ECOWAS, because when they are big, they are not manipulable. And when on the 14th and 15th days of last year, the African heads of states and government were summoned, and I use the word summoned very deliberately, to Washington, D.C. After the president had spoken to them and given them photo ops, Africa was given 60 billion. 54 countries, 60 billion. And then the American president started engaging in bilateral agreements with Burundi, with Lesotho, with Kenya. That is what we are saying, that going forward we must be conscious. And as to training, our own Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in a book called The River Between, tells his lead character Wayaki, go unto him, learn what he has taught you, but bring it home and customize it for the benefit of our people. Learning is universal and defies geography, but there is wisdom in using that learning for our benefit. And very lastly, how do we distinguish the institutional conceptual West, which is diabolical, and the individual members of those countries that actually sometimes are on our side? Institutionalized conceptual West, as articulated through government, is fundamentally diabolical. Their pretension to the contrary notwithstanding. And therefore, when we engage with them, we must have our guards up. We are capable, in my view, of discerning who is better, and that is the duty of our leadership. Our leadership doesn't do a good job out of it, and that is why the demand from the civil society, the demand from academia must remind leadership at all times, you are dining, and I'm using this as a term of art, that when you are dining with the devil, you must do so with a long spoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I don't know that you wanted to respond to the issue of definition earlier on, or indeed any comments that you might have.
Let us not drown ourselves in semantics. This is my view with due respect. First of all, let us remember that, and I always warn us Africans, if I was using my mother tongue to define interference, or using a Kiswahili word, what meaning would it carry? And sometimes we find ourselves prisoners of Portuguese, prisoners of French, prisoners of English, or any other colonial language which we have appropriated and which we now deploy in terms of engagement. History has demonstrated, and my good friend Kegoro said it, history has demonstrated not once, not twice, that the intentions appear to be noble in the beginning, but when they have come in like the proverbial Trojan horse, they go beyond their mandate. Show me what is happening to Libya today. Show me what is happening to the Central African Republic. Show me what is happening to Somalia today. They were all well-intentioned, and see the product. A tree shall be judged by its fruit. A mango that says it is an orange is still a mango. Thank you.
Okay, Honorable Biruta, over to you.
Yes, I think Professor Lumumba has said what I wanted to say. This is really semantics. I gave a general definition, kind of, but intervention and interference all depends on who invites or who justifies an intervention, and you can find nuances in various situations. Libya cases and Iraq cases were mentioned, and those who made those interventions will say that they were justified, and eventually that they were invited by people who were being threatened or killed. There was the case of Rwanda, where a foreign intervention was called for, not by the government, but by some other groups and by the people who were being threatened to be killed. So all these is, all those are nuances you can find in various situations, but basically intervention where you have not been invited by a state is an interference. And intervention can be military, it could be cultural. You know, when you come to a country and you want to impose your own culture, your own beliefs, it is interference. So those are nuances. It is just semantics. We can find various situations where intervention relates to interference and where there are some differences. But on what Professor Lumumba just said, okay, African Union or Africa or African states are invited to various fora by various powers. Again, it is about us to know the reason why we are going there, for what? Should we go as individual state or as a continent, as a union? We have the power to decide that. And even if you go, all of us, if we go to the US or wherever, I guess that every leader who is going there has an agenda for his own country, for his own people. He's just not going there to get instructions or to sign whatever is presented to him. It comes back to us, the leadership. What do we want for our people? And how are we defending the interests of our people? We can do it individually as a state, and there is no small state. There are just states, a small one or a big one. A small state can even have the power to defend its own interests better than a big one. And it is also true that if we come together as regions or as a continent, we have a bargaining power, and we can deal with these big powers and be able to get our own interests through. But again, it is about us. We know all these problems. We know that all these powers are dealing with us. They are pursuing their own interests. Don't we have interests ourselves? Don't we know them? Can't we put them together and get a strategy agree on a strategy to defend our own interests? If we go, we discussed earlier on us going outside for studies and whatever. Yes, someone said we can learn and domesticate what we have learned from outside. And we need actually to know these societies we are dealing with. If we want to deal with China, if we want to do business with China, we need to know their society, their culture. So it comes back all the time to ourselves. How do we understand our own interests? How do we understand our development? And how we can achieve that? How do we go to those foreign powers to defend our own interests, the interests of our countries, individual countries, our regional blocs, or our continent. I think we have the power to achieve that. We need just to change our mindset and do the right things. Thank you.
Mrs. Thank you very much indeed. Chairperson, the question about EU funding, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Le colonel Diop a posé une question importante concernant le financement. Et c'est justement là où le bas blesse. Je rappelle qu'à partir de 2003, l'Union africaine a élaboré l'architecture. On a mis en place un conseil paix et sécurité. On a mis en place un panel des sages dans le cadre de la diplomatie préventive. On a décidé de former des forces africaines, les forces africaines en attente. Nous avons créé un fonds de la paix. Le continent est confronté à deux questions importantes. Celle de la Corne de l'Afrique, donc ATMIS, qui était précédée par AMISOM, et la question du Sahel. Sur la question du financement, les responsabilités sont partagées entre les États africains et la communauté internationale, notamment le Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Quand bien même le Conseil a qualifié El-Shabaab de groupe terroriste, il a qualifié AQMI, État islamique, Boko Haram et autres comme des mouvements terroristes. Le terroriste est une menace à la paix et à la sécurité internationale. C'est le Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies qui a la responsabilité en matière de maintien de la paix et de la sécurité. L'argument qui est le nôtre, celui de l'Afrique, depuis une dizaine d'années, au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, est que cette lutte doit être financée sur les ressources pérennes des Nations Unies. Ça n'a pas été le cas. C'est pourquoi il a fallu mettre en place la MISOM, avec la contribution des États de la région, et avec des financements des partenaires essentiellement de l'Union européenne. Il faut reconnaître quand même que l'Union européenne a dépensé pas moins de 4 milliards d'euros pour le financement de la MISOM depuis une quinzaine d'années. Quand bien même les forces sont des forces africaines mobilisées par des États essentiellement de la zone de l'Afrique de l'Est. Nous sommes arrivés depuis 2 ans à MISOM, et maintenant nous sommes arrivés à ATMIS parce qu'il est question de préparer le retrait de cette mission et de laisser la responsabilité aux forces de défense et de sécurité de la Somalie. Le constat est que, après une quinzaine d'années, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, la Somalie n'a pas les forces de défense et de sécurité nécessaires pour pouvoir assumer la responsabilité de protéger le pays. Al-Shabaab continue à survivre, ils sont résilients, ils ont des capacités de nuisance extraordinaires. Et les financements attendus des Nations Unies, conformément à la charte, ne sont pas disponibles. C'est la même chose au Sahel. D'abord, c'était une mission de l'Union africaine. Elle a été réunie par la MINUSMA au Mali. Le général Kazour a été parmi les premiers responsables, chefs des casques bleus dans cette région il y a 10 ans, je rappelais. Et pendant 10 ans, nous avons toujours tablé des résolutions au nom de l'Union africaine au Conseil de sécurité pour dire que c'est une menace, c'est le terrorisme et l'intégrisme religieux, et donc il faut financer ces missions. Mieux, les États de la région, le G5, les 5 États du Sahel, ont mis en place une force. Chaque pays était disponible à mettre en place au moins 1000 hommes. On n'a pas pu avoir le financement qui était au départ estimé à 500 millions de dollars pour qu'il y ait une force africaine de la région avec un mandat offensif d'aller combattre les terroristes là où ils sont. On n'a pas eu le financement, alors qu'il y a une mission des Nations Unies qui coûte au moins $1 milliard par an et qui est toujours au Mali. Ça, c'est une contradiction fondamentale sur la notion du maintien de la paix. Il n'y a pas de paix à maintenir au nord du Mali, dans le Sahel. Il y a une paix à imposer. Et pour imposer la paix, il faut un mandat offensif sous chapitre 7 pour que ces forces-là combattent les terroristes. Ça n'a pas été possible. Donc voilà les contradictions en matière de financement. Et donc, il n'est pas surprenant qu'aujourd'hui, avec ATMIS, la dernière réunion, je crois que le colonel a peut-être pris part, il était question d'évaluer le budget qui est nécessaire jusqu'à fin décembre 2024 pour finir la mission de ATMIS en Somalie. Il y a une estimation de quelques 85 millions de dollars qu'il faut pouvoir financer, et ce financement a été demandé à l'Union européenne. C'est normal. Et donc, nous, au niveau du Fonds de la paix, nous avons pu les relancer depuis quelques années. Nous sommes aux alentours de 350 millions. Mais ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que ces fonds-là, si on les met pour des missions de maintien de la paix ou surtout d'imposition de la paix, ils ne seront pas suffisants. Parce que si vous avez 10 000 à 15 000 hommes qu'il faut payer, le matériel qu'il faut payer, la logistique qu'il faut payer, cela ne peut pas être à la portée du Fonds de la paix tel qu'il est actuellement. Aujourd'hui, le débat, c'est comment alors mettre en place effectivement l'architecture africaine du maintien de la paix. Il faut se rappeler quand même, puisque les gens sont identifiés comme terroristes, il est même interdit de négocier avec ces mouvements. On ne peut pas interdire de négocier avec les mouvements, qu'il faut le combattre et ne pas se donner les moyens de le combattre. Ça, ce sont des questions fondamentales et je crois que 10 ans, 15 ans après, il est absolument nécessaire de faire une évaluation objective et voir comment il faut faire face au phénomène du terrorisme qui se manifeste dans plusieurs régions dans le continent africain. C'est une menace à la paix internationale. Il faut que les systèmes des Nations Unies, dont nous sommes partis, puissent assumer ses responsabilités. Cela n'exclut pas la responsabilité des Africains et nous-mêmes. Il est bien vrai que le phénomène au départ n'était pas endogène, mais maintenant, ils recrutent sur place. Ce sont des jeunes Africains qui sont recrutés. Alors, ça rappelle à la question de la gouvernance, la question de la manière dont ces États sont gérés. Et donc, c'est un problème plus complexe pour lequel il faut prendre les dispositions nécessaires pour éviter que des États ne soient sous la coupe de groupes extrémistes ou mafieux. Et ça, c'est l'un des défis majeurs aujourd'hui du continent dans ces États pris individuellement et collectivement. Si on veut faire prévaloir des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, il faut s'en donner les moyens. Et c'est là dès le départ. Merci.
Chairperson, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. When I listen to your narration of all these huge challenges that Africa is facing, and our hopeful exit point is 2063, it looks totally impossible. Do you sometimes feel like you just want to go back to N'Djamena and rest when all this is overwhelming?
Écoutez, on ne peut pas démissionner. On ne peut pas fuir les difficultés. Au contraire. We cannot give up. We should do what is possible to be able to deal with this kind of challenges. It is our responsibility.
I'll let her continue. Okay. Thank you. Let's come back to our two questions, please. It would help if you only restrict yourself to just one question, keep it short, so that we can have as many. I think we had, number 3 was just over here.
Thank you very much, moderator. Once again, I'm Major General George Igumba, the commandant of the Senior Command and Staff College, Chimaka, Uganda. I do wholly subscribe to the submissions of the distinguished panelists. But then, with due humility, I'm irresistibly uncomfortable with the topic. Foreign interference. Had I had a hand in the process of formulating the topic, I would probably have settled for something like this: external influence and exploitation or exploration, even as far as defilement of Africa. Because if I may pick it from the submission earlier on by the Honorable Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Rwanda, foreign could be subjective or even relative. Why do I opine so? The legendary white man or woman, whatever gender he or she may have been, who allegedly came with the Bible in hand, was, as far as I recall, invited by our forefathers or foremothers, at least for Uganda. John Huntington Speke, James Grant, Sir Samuel Baker may not have been necessarily missionaries. They were explorers. They were expeditionists. These were military guys at much lower ranks of captain, lieutenant, at most colonel. And everyone in this congregation will agree that at that level, one's blood is hot. One's blood drives one to move as far as he or she can in order to find out. When they finally linked up with our leaders, traditional leaders of the time, as I said earlier, at least for Uganda, those leaders requested for the missionaries in writing. Maybe they were coached, because I doubt whether they knew how to write or read by then, but maybe the explorers coached them in drafting the invitation letters, and the poor guys responded, and they came. Remember, the Arabs had been here much earlier than even the Christian missionaries, at least in the East African region. And the Arabs, the last time I peeped into a mosque, Muslims don't pray with their eyes closed, unless if I peeped into a quack one. So, we may not be really fair in as much as there are positives and negatives. The only way which I would suggest, in a bid to balance, to stabilize the boat, is two ways. One, let us speak and ride on the positives of the perceived intruders, perceived interveners, perceived whatever. Two, let us fiercely resist the negatives of them. I do humbly submit.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Moderator, sir, I am Major Sande Felicie from Rwanda Defense Force. I am a student. African governments and the regional organization have recognized the detrimental effects of foreign interferences and have taken steps to address them. Efforts including strengthening regional cooperation mechanism, promoting good governance, and advocating for fair trade and investment practices. However, countering enduring foreign interferences remain a complex. Ongoing challenges. What are some specific strategies or initiatives should be taken by African governments and the regional bodies to promote good governance and advocate for fair trade and investment practices as part of their efforts to counter enduring foreign interferences? I wish to direct my question to Professor Lumumba, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm also on the lookout, especially for students, please. I can take one more, please, just here in front. And yeah.
Thank you very much. I am KK, I'm a retired military officer. I wanted to ask Professor Lumumba to comment.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. There was someone behind you, but we'll come back to you. Sorry about that. So that we don't have interference with the microphones. Yes, please.
Je suis le général de brigade Kabissa de Monsieur, chef du département des opérations de paix à la force en attente de l'Afrique orientale. Au nom de l'ISF, je voudrais d'abord remercier la force de défense du Rwanda pour avoir pensé à notre organisation pour participer à ce symposium. Ma question se dirige directement vers le président de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Monsieur le Président de la Commission de l'Union africaine, permettez-moi, comme nous sommes en face des officiers stagiaires, de penser autrement au concept de l'Union africaine. L'Union africaine a un concept cher ou un slogan ou une devise qui parle de solutions africaines aux problèmes africains. Au regard des interventions de différents conférenciers, vous avez la même approche sur les conséquences exogènes et endogènes sur le continent africain, sur le plan sécuritaire, particulièrement les conséquences négatives. Donc, pour dire que l'insécurité en Afrique, c'est une responsabilité partagée, la responsabilité, bien sûr, des Africains, mais aussi la responsabilité des acteurs étrangers. Et nonobstant, l'Union africaine, en parlant de solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, je crois que l'Union africaine met de côté la part des acteurs extérieurs dans l'insécurité en Afrique. Et quand on s'accuse de ne pas pouvoir financer le coût de la sécurité en Afrique, je crois qu'on oublie la responsabilité des acteurs extérieurs dans l'insécurité ou dans la déstabilisation de l'Afrique. Et ici, vous savez que les pays africains, en contribuant au budget de sécurité de l'Union africaine, ils tirent leur contribution des impôts des contribuables africains. Et si on s'approprie des problèmes qu'on n'a pas causés, est-ce que c'est C'est normal que l'Afrique trouve des solutions aux problèmes qui n'a pas à lui seul causé. Est-ce que ce n'est pas injuste de chercher des solutions africaines aux problèmes qui ne sont pas seulement africains? Je vous donne un petit exemple. Prenons la côte somalienne. C'est une côte de plus de 3300 une ligne côtière de plus de 3300 kilomètres. Et si on voit les bateaux qui circulent dans l'océan Indien, est-ce que ce sont les Africains qui bénéficient de cet océan Indien quand il est sécurisé? Il y a beaucoup de pays qui bénéficient de la sécurité au niveau de l'océan Indien. Et qu'est-ce qu'elle leur part au niveau de la sécurité en Afrique? Merci.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question, please. Yes, just in front. And I'll come back for another round.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai une préoccupation à adresser à Monsieur le Président de la Commission. J'aimerais avoir la permission du ministre Biruta pour le faire rien qu'en tant qu'ambassadeur du Congo, mais pas doyen du corps diplomatique. Monsieur le Président, il y a un intervenant qui a insisté sur l'application des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains. Et j'aimerais vous poser la question de savoir, Monsieur le Président, quels sont les résultats du mécanisme africain d'évaluation par les pairs aujourd'hui. Un autre volet de la même préoccupation, on a dit ici que l'Afrique doit aussi apprendre des autres, oui, mais sauf que ces savoirs, quand nous les ramenons dans le continent, ces savoirs sont rendus dans les langues des autres, dans les langues étrangères. Prenons simplement le cas du signal Internet, par exemple. Et si nous le conduisons jusqu'au fin fond de nos villages, mais si toutes les inscriptions, le mode d'emploi, s'il est dans les langues des autres, comment les populations paysannes peuvent accéder à cet instrument aujourd'hui déterminant pour la vie de tous les jours? Et aussi sur le même registre, nous avons tout suivi il n'y a pas longtemps que le Swahili est désormais la langue de travail de l'Union africaine. Est-ce qu'elle est en dormance ou elle est active au niveau de Addis? Elle participe aux travaux quotidiens des différentes commissions au niveau de l'Union africaine. Et dernière question, Monsieur le Président, à quand l'inscription d'une langue commune africaine dans les programmes scolaires au niveau du continent? Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Let's take those ones first. I'll start with you, Prof. There was one for you.
The general from Uganda, let me, in my view, correct history. Correct history because the Uganda he's talking about did not exist at the time of exploration. And it is not true that what he said happened. I know, for example, that Kabarega of the Bunyoro Kitara Empire resisted the British and was exiled. It is also true that the British approach to colonization was divide and rule. So what they did was to divide and plant ethnic animosity and entered into pacts with the Buganda kingdom, other kingdoms. In Kenya, they did so with the Maasai and other kingdoms. So it was a strategy. So the purported invitation was not an invitation, but people were led by their nose. People were led by their nose to believe that something good was going to happen to them. And I would urge the good general to read a book by Adekeye Adebajo, The Curse of Berlin, Africa After the Cold War. He speaks to these things in a very proper way. And in my view, that book is useful for all of us who are here. Now, to the question that I've been asked, that is, what can Africa do, particularly with foreign interference? Let us understand that the international economic architecture, as I see it, is one in which Africa did not participate, does not participate in a meaningful way. Take, for example, the Bretton Woods institution that we know about, the World Bank and the IMF, created in 1944 in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. British economists and American economists immediately after the World War II to target the reparation of Europe through the Marshall Plan. We are grafted into it, and then we become beholden to them. So that when you hear IMF is in your country, you ought to be very worried, because the prescriptions is one size fits all. And if you doubt me, you will remember the prescriptions of the IMF during the structural adjustment in 1980s. Not a single country came out of it in a proper shape. We are not involved in that architecture. Remember also the WTO. The very first meeting of the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco had a component of the WTO. The WTO, as we know it today, is also constructed in a manner that does not benefit us. The idea is that Africa continues to remain a producer of primary goods, and we continue to consume goods that have value addition. How then has Africa tried to react to this? There have been several initiatives. The very early initiatives were not even constructed by Africa. If you remember the African Pacific, Caribbean Pacific, the Lomé Convention, and the Cotonou Declaration, these were initiatives which were influenced from outside. It is after the failure of the Lomé Convention that Africa now said, we want to have our own, hence the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, because Africa recognized trade within Europe is at almost 60%. Trade within North America is at anything 57%. Trade within Asia is at 50%. Trade within Latin America is at 40%. Trade within Africa, 15%. But the Lagos Plan of Action did not realize the dreams that we set for ourselves. So Africa has always identified the solution to our problems. In fact, and the president of the commission, or the chairman commission, will agree with me, if you listen to Kwame Nkrumah when he spoke on 24th day of May, 1963, he said, the only way in which we are going to ensure that we survive in this hostile world is to have one government. Perhaps some said he was naive, he was too idealistic, but he could see it. He could see that the smaller we are, the weaker we are in all aspects. He said, even one army, even one foreign policy, he said. And people thought he was naive. In 2013, when we came up with Africa Agenda 2063, and I invite you to read the letter written by Nkosazana and Dlamini Zuma, from whom the president took over. She's apologizing to Kwame Nkrumah. She's saying, we wish we listened to you. So what are we doing as Africa in terms of trying to deal with this foreign interference? Having recognized these, first of all, under the REX, The East African community, you remember there was the Committee of Fast Tracking of the East African Community and East African Confederation. The first president of East Africa ought to have been sworn in 2010. It did not happen. As I'm talking to you, there is now a body that is moving around trying to create a constitution for the East African Confederation, which is a realization that if we want to interfere, if we want to stop foreign interference and we want to engage constructively, we must have a big market, and that market will be the East African market. Hence, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Somalis are coming in, and I'm told the Ethiopians are also contemplating. And not only in East Africa, in ECOWAS, there was even an attempt to create a currency called the ECO, which was torpedoed, as you know, by the French. And in SADC, these are ways and means of immunizing ourselves against the machinations of not only Europe, but China. China is increasingly coming into the continent. Russia is increasingly coming into the continent. Turkey is increasingly coming into the continent. Qatar is increasingly coming into the continent. The Emiratis are coming into the continent. So we are seeing all these things happening. But beyond the RECs, there is also the African Union. If you read Africa Agenda 2063 and the 7 aspirations, they are designed specifically to ensure that we form a bulwark against these foreign interference. And let me correct myself if I was misunderstood. They are small nations. Let's not delude ourselves. The theory of sovereignty of nations is a fiction. Right now, we will have meeting of the G7. Why? Because they are bigger economies and we are not there. Then we'll have the G20, which are slightly bigger. Then they are the smaller nations and they met recently in Brussels. So we must distinguish the fiction of equality of nations and the reality of nations. And when, therefore, we want to negotiate at the continent of Africa, we are saying the bigger we are, the better we are. So efforts are there. And as I conclude, I'm saying, if we look at Agenda 2063 and we look at Africa Continental Free Trade Area to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers, to allow for the free movement of persons, then we would be in a better position to engage. And I'll give this example. Look at East Africa. We said that we did not want second-hand clothing. Rwanda accepted. Then Uganda and Tanzania were persuaded by the United States of America, and we dropped out. This is what divide and rule is all about. So these things that we are talking about, they are not going to be realized in your lifetime. These are intergenerational battles. And our duty, as Nyerere said on the 6th day of March 1997, this generation has a duty to carry the torch. And the worst mistake that we can make is to lose hope and to despair. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof, thank you. Chairperson, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Solution africaine aux problèmes africains. Je crois qu'il faut aller du postulat suivant. Quoique nous vivons dans un monde inégal, injuste, mais nous appartenons, nous aussi en tant que continent, à cette communauté internationale. Et donc, il faut chercher à concilier des concepts comme l'indépendance, la souveraineté, non-ingérence, non-indifférence, sécurité collective, valeurs partagées. Enfin, c'est un tout. Il ne faut pas être dans une position juste de dichotomie. Il y a les bons et les mauvais d'un côté et les autres. Quand on parle des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains, cela n'exclut pas forcément les autres partenaires. Les États africains font plus du quart des membres des Nations Unies, par exemple. Et donc, ce concept va sur le postulat qu'il faut prioriser, parce que chaque société Chaque groupe humain a des valeurs et il a sa manière de régler un certain nombre de problèmes. Je prends l'exemple de la justice transitionnelle. Prenons l'exemple du Rwanda, un pays qui a connu un génocide. Malgré les ingérences extérieures, c'est comme si personne ne voyait, alors que c'était au vu au su de tout le monde. En 100 jours, 1 million de personnes ont été assassinées. Ça également, c'est une responsabilité de la communauté internationale. Mais pour régler le problème, par exemple, la justice transitionnelle, les gachacha, par exemple, dans ce pays, ça, c'est une approche typiquement africaine, typiquement rwandaise, pour régler un problème qui s'est posé dans une société donnée. Donc, quand on dit solution africaine aux problèmes africains, cela n'exclut pas forcément les partenaires. La responsabilité partagée, j'ai évoqué la question en matière de financement. Vous savez que selon la Charte des Nations Unies, c'est le Conseil de sécurité qui est en charge du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité dans le monde. Puisqu'on a qualifié le terrorisme et l'extrémisme violent comme une menace à la paix et à la sécurité, nous sommes fondés juridiquement à demander à cette institution, puisque le phénomène se développe dans nos pays, de financer les opérations pour mettre un terme à ces phénomènes. Vous l'aurez remarqué, des coalitions internationales ont été formées en Irak, en Syrie, avec des centaines de milliers d'hommes et des milliards qui ont été dépensés pour arrêter le terrorisme, l'État islamique, Al-Qaïda et autres. Nous avons demandé à ce que ces coalitions-là puissent se former également pour extraire ces phénomènes du continent africain. Ce qui n'a pas été fait. Ce qui n'a pas été fait. Alors, c'est pour cela que j'ai dit, ces phénomènes-là, c'est une question. Nous avons notre responsabilité, parce que le problème se pose chez nous. Même si les autres n'interviennent pas, nous sommes obligés de faire face avec les moyens dont nous disposons. Donc, il y a une responsabilité collective. Donc, il n'y a pas forcément, quand on dit solution africaine aux problèmes africains, une exclusion des partenaires, et moins encore du système des Nations Unies dont nous sommes partis nous-mêmes. La responsabilité, donc, elle est d'abord africaine. Pour ce qui concerne les côtes somaliennes, les phénomènes de la piraterie, je crois que la réponse qui a été apportée a été une réponse internationale. Les Européens, les Américains, tout le monde est intervenu pour faire face au phénomène. Mais quoi qu'on dise, si un phénomène, même s'il est exogène, mais s'il se manifeste sur votre territoire, je crois que la responsabilité première, le réflexe même, je dirais, c'est d'y faire face parce que cela se passe dans votre pays. Les seconds intervenants sur la question du MAEP, mécanisme africain de l'évaluation par les pairs, c'est un mécanisme qui a été conçu et qui était facultatif. Aujourd'hui, 36 États africains ont accepté de rentrer dans ce mécanisme, dont les résultats sont assez mitigés, il faut le reconnaître. Mais récemment, il y a 3 ans, nous avons institué que le MAEP doit annuellement faire un rapport sur la gouvernance dans le continent africain. Je crois que c'est une avancée significative. Donc, il est de la responsabilité des attributions de ces mécanismes d'établir chaque année un rapport global sur le continent pour voir où nous en sommes pour ce qui concerne la gouvernance, qui est l'un des défis majeurs dans ce continent. La question de l'utilisation des langues, c'est vrai, c'est très important. Nous avons comme langue de travail l'anglais, le français, l'arabe, le portugais. Récemment, nous avons ajouté l'espagnol. Le swahili également est une langue de travail et on l'utilise. Techniquement, nous sommes en train de travailler pour pouvoir recruter des interprètes et autres. Ce sont des questions pratiques, mais ceci a été accepté par les États membres. La question de la promotion des langues nationales, je crois que ça fait partie de la politique de nos États membres, y compris de l'Union africaine. Aujourd'hui, certains linguistes nous conseillent de mettre l'accent sur les langues qui dépassent des États, comme le Swahili, comme le Hausa, comme le Lingala, entre autres langues qui couvrent un espace important, englobant parfois plusieurs États membres. Donc la promotion des langues africaines, des langues nationales africaines est un objectif important, ne serait-ce que pour pouvoir alphabétiser, vulgariser un certain nombre de choses. Nous avons besoin de faire la promotion des langues africaines. Voilà globalement le problème qui se pose. Donc il n'y a pas forcément dichotomie entre le fait qu'on privilégie des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains et l'implication des partenaires externes ou une organisation continentale comme les Nations Unies, dont, ce que je disais, nous constituons un peu plus même du quart des membres. Voilà, merci.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me come back for, I want to prioritize our students, please. They've been very quiet. If you may. There was
one question from a student, which was not...
Oh, really? Did I miss one?
On regional integration and specific measures.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Regional.
Yeah.
Regional integration.
Mr. Do you want to have a go?
I thought we answered it a little about regional integration.
Yeah.
Or specific towards regional integration. I think that there is a sense in which there's directs the regional organizations. East Africa is the one that I think is closest to integration. Because as I said at the very outset, we had the East African community, which, as you know, died in 1970, as was revived again in 1999. And the original members, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, have subsequently, after the 1999 treaty, Rwanda are now members, Burundi are members, South Sudan is a member, and recently we admitted the Democratic Republic of Congo. The whole idea was to create a federation. And in the year 2004, the then heads of state did appoint a committee for fast-tracking. And a report was given talking about how we are going to have a common currency, a common tariff, and common services. And indeed, some of the things are already happening. It is only in the area of common currency, which we thought we would have in 2024. I don't think we will. And then, of course, the idea of having a political federation, as I've already said, there is a committee going round. And the idea of the federation is that we make sure that there is free movement of persons, and certain countries are ahead. Rwanda, for example, I think is ahead of the region in terms of offering opportunities for employment and permits. There are certain countries like Burundi which are still lagging behind, but the whole idea is that ultimately we'll have a confederation, and that confederation will be a confederation where we will have a president. In fact, under the fast-tracking document, all ministers in charge of East African integration ought to have moved and ought to have been operating from Arusha in Dar es Salaam by the year 2010. So that is moving apace. In SADC region, where we thought South Africa would be the anchor, I don't think that that has, beyond the trade issues, the political question is one that has not come out as strongly as it should. And that is for a number of reasons. First of all, South Africa reeling from apartheid, and then Mozambique and Angola there with the Portuguese tradition. But you can see that trade is one of the major drivers. In ECOWAS, we also know that Nigeria is the anchor in that regard. They were moving towards a monetary policy. And in fact, there is an ECOWAS passport in the same way that there is an East African passport. So in a nutshell, Central Africa is problematic. The Maghreb is problematic. And that is something that we must talk, because in the early days, and you just give me a little latitude on this, Joe. In the early days, in the 1960s, we had clear Pan-Africanists in the Maghreb. King Hassan of Morocco hosted certain meetings in Casablanca, Morocco, Mokhtar al-Dada in Mauritania, Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, Hamid Ben Bella in Algeria, and Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. But in the recent past, we now have individuals who are undecided as to whether they want to be part of the African continent or they want to be part of the Arab. So the Maghreb is a little problematic, and Morocco, you know, at one time even left the African Union. So in a nutshell, the drive, the hunger is there, and the push is there. So personally, I'm not very worried. I think that what we ought to do is to plant this seed so that the fire keeps burning, because it is through this regional integration that we ultimately will have an African Union. And easier said than done, perhaps we are too optimistic, but is optimism not the mother's milk of progress?
Prof, thank you. Minister, then I come to you, sir.
I just wanted to add on what Professor Lumumba said. At the continental level, there are specific measures which are provided for in Agenda 2063, what we used to call flagship projects in various sectors: infrastructure, railway networks, and airports, and internet infrastructure. There is one of these projects is the African Continental Free Trade Area, the African Passport, African University. There is a list of flagship projects, and those are specific measures which need to be implemented just to let us achieve, to make us achieve the continental integration, in addition to the regional integration, which has just been talked about.
Okay, come to you, Chairperson.
J'ajouterai tout simplement pour rappeler que l'OUA, en 1991, a adopté le traité d'Abuja qui met en place la communauté économique africaine. C'est sur cette base qu'ont été érigées les communautés économiques régionales. SADC, ECOWAS, ECAS, Eastern African Community, IGAD, UMA, Union du Maghreb arabe. Toutes ces communautés économiques régionales ont été mises en place, et dans la réforme, appelée réforme Kagame, à partir de 2017, on a maintenant le deuxième sommet annuel a été transformé en un sommet de coordination. Donc chaque année au mois de juillet, se tient un sommet qui réunit le bureau de la conférence, les chefs d'État et les chefs exécutifs des différentes communautés économiques régionales, la Commission et le NEPAD pour un sommet généralement au mois de juillet pour faire le point sur les questions d'intégration, les questions de développement économique et social. En matière de gouvernance, parce que l'étudiant a posé également, il y a une stratégie africaine de bonne gouvernance qui a été mise en place, mais j'avoue que c'est le maillon le plus faible dans le continent. Quand on voit des coups d'État militaires, notamment en Afrique de l'Ouest, la CEDEAO était prise comme modèle, un modèle de démocratie, d'élections libres, et il y a des valeurs partagées qui ont été adoptées par l'Union africaine, y compris dans l'agenda 2063, que nous optons pour la démocratie élective. Malheureusement, nous constatons un recul dans un certain nombre de pays où des coups d'État militaires sont advenus, où des changements non constitutionnels du gouvernement ont été constatés, et il faut naturellement revenir, parce que sans la bonne gouvernance, je crois que tout le projet africain ne pourra jamais s'exécuter. Ça, c'est une exigence. Puisqu'on l'a adopté, il faut être ferme, il faut que les responsables, les leaders soient comptables devant les populations qui les ont élus. Et justement, c'est là où se trouve le nœud et peut-être la solution du problème. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chairperson. Before I come back to questions, a quick comment from Brian, and then we can come back for more questions.
In fact, I'm glad. I think I already said to the minister that myself and a couple of lawyers, Prof, we would like to discuss one. There is a specific mechanism at Malabo. The African region, African Union, was the first region in the world to define a crime of unconstitutional change of government. That included all the usual things that we talked about, but also questions such as tinkering with constitutions and etc. However, I think as the reforms have gone along, attention to the human rights architecture has not been as thorough. And obviously we have to be careful, because it's also the architecture that's likely to be used for all sorts of interference and etc. But the investment and thinking through the question of the African Court of Justice, the Court of Human Rights and the Commission is central. I, in earlier conversations, had suggested when the ambassadors met that it is absolutely imperative to upgrade the Africa governance architecture to almost the status that you have the peace and security architecture, in the sense that most of what we had in governance, which was local governance and all the other things from Ezulwini up to now, are treated almost as NGO talk. By the time we get to the peace and security architecture, we are now dealing with a live problem. The preemptive work that's in between addressing member state compliance with the shared values instruments of the African Union. I'm not talking about foreign instruments, instruments that the member states have agreed to, which is the Charter on Values and Principles of the Public Service, Charter and Values of Decentralization and Local Governance, African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. So as I think the minister said, as the chairperson said, the normative frameworks exist. What we need to think through now is how do you make them coherent, number one, how do you sustainably resource them? And I'm not just talking about money. Member states have for many years adopted the approach, and with respect, Minister and Chairperson, they send to the African Union not their best talent, but people they don't know what to do with, or they want to manage out or promote out. And the African Union itself and its employment has never made Pan-Africanism or a Pan-African mindset as the basis of employment. So the orientation in some of the senior employees within the African Union chairperson are quite contrary to the political statements we make. So addressing, I think that's what you wanted to know, is Africa has gone further than most regions. It has the normative frameworks, it has the institutional architecture. We now have to address coherence and making sure our resourcing, both financial, material, and human resourcing, is top-notch. We need our best talent at the African Union because these are the people, from what I am hearing in the audience, our expectation, Minister and Chairperson, is that you will negotiate that when a country wants to talk to Africa, they can talk to the African Union or they can talk to SADC. But if we're not sending our best people there, then there is a real danger that the technical expertise and support will become fragmented and will revert back to what each individual state wants. And when we go to that, we're easily fragmented. I think for you in the audience, everybody who says African Union is useless and so on and so forth, and who are frustrated with the African Union, just remember what Chinua Achebe said. We are not the children of Africa. We are the parents of Africa, because the Africa that we want is yet to be born. And we are the ones that history has charged with the responsibility to give birth to the Africa we want. So whatever we are frustrated with respect to the African Union, our responsibility is how do we make the normative frameworks and the institutions work, but how do we build the repository of expertise so that the African Union at any given time has access to the best brains, the best technical expertise in any field on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
A brief one. I just wanted to reassure my colleague here that Rwanda is exactly doing what he is recommending. We are choosing the best talent for the African Union, and we are supporting them to deliver on their mandate. And I can also confirm to you that Chad did the same when they proposed the chairperson to lead our union. Thank you.
Vivement que l'appel du frère soit entendu par nos États membres.
Okay, and can I just check, Chairperson, that when member states are not making contributions to the AU, but they do meet the obligations to IMF, World Bank, is that right, or no? I'm just wondering.
J'avoue que ces derniers temps, on a pris un certain nombre de mesures, y compris des sanctions. Suspension, vous ne voulez pas le droit de vote. Et donc, le nouveau mécanisme a poussé les États à être plus réguliers dans le paiement de leurs contributions. Le fait est que nous avons opté pour une méthode de prélèvement automatique de 0,2%. Il y a beaucoup de difficultés à le faire appliquer pour certains États. Mais j'avoue qu'avec la prise des dernières décisions, le taux de contribution s'est sensiblement amélioré. Ça, il faut le reconnaître.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, back to the floor. Yes, yes, your hand is right up. I will try to be very democratic. Yeah, that's question one. Oh boy, and my students, we don't see them. Yes, please. You're number two, with a broad smile. Yeah. And question three, let me look on this. So, yes. So 1, 2, 3, and then we'll try and be, if you're very direct to the point and with one question, we can move a lot more quick and get more questions in, please. Sir, over to you.
Sir, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Innocent Gisagara from Rwanda Defense Force and a student. Sir, my question, I begin with a quote. We should stop blame games and focus on our problem solving by Honorable Foreign Minister of Rwanda in recent hours ago. Now, my question is, the instability and violence in Africa has been characterized by rebel groups with logistical support, training, political support, and even strategic support. Who are the actors and what should be done to stop these destructive interferences and stabilize our continent for future and current development? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Simplice Mulenzi from the RDF, a student. So, my question goes to His Excellency Musa Faki and Professor P.L.O Lumumba. Sir, you earlier mentioned of lack of political will by some countries or heads of states who agree on some decision today and change their mind tomorrow. And to me, this sounds actually to have frustrated or undermined efforts to find solutions facing African Union. An example is the $0.2% earlier mentioned on imports to finance the African Union activities. So as a way of evaluating the reasons for lack of this political will, I request to know if you have ever tried to find out why our leaders or our heads of states have two different languages. And if yes, I request that you shed more light on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the third one.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, Your Excellencies. My name is Lieutenant General Nakibus La Kara. I am not the CDF. I was tasked by the CDF to participate. So don't see CDF and think I am. I am not. Really, just listening to the panelists, the first question really, and this arises from 6 or 7 years ago, I participated at a symposium at the National Defense College headquarters, Nyakinama. And this was localized. It was just the students and a few professors, But today, this symposium has taken a huge leap. And today to see the chairperson, His Excellency Mohammed of the African Union Commission, and the renowned and revered P.L.O. here with us. And the question therefore is, so we thank the RDF and the Republic of Rwanda for really building on this platform of engagement. And the question here would be to the chairperson, to the honorable chairperson. This is not to put you on the spot, really. And it is also sad that you are here and there are students here. There should have been probably a different forum. But the Honorable P.L.O. Lumumba would disagree that, let us undress and see our nakedness as it is, really. But you know that some of us are constrained given background. But it's good to hear this fiery, volatile voice from P.L.O. Lumumba and Mr. Kagoro. Would such a discourse as this take place at a high level at the African Union, where we speak to ourselves at that executive level? Would it ever take place in a very honest and having those candid discussions? Mr. Kagoro, I am amazed at what the natives have had to say here. Amazed. And I just didn't know it exists, that natives can say so much. And because, Mr. Kagoro, you yourself, you've enumerated the Africans who are assassinated. And because of the patriotism and the Pan-Africanism they were pursuing, the risks are there. Don't you think the risks are still there? And if the risks are there, if you cannot be isolated, who then will pursue such? Mr. Kagoro, this Pan-Africanism that we all talk about, and the Honorable His Excellency Mohammed also, this Pan-Africanism has really, P.L.O. Lumumba agrees, this Pan-Africanism, this, fervor for it, is gone down. It's gone down. How can we possibly, rekindle it? Rekindle it. Because Mr. Kagoro, you alluded to the fact that even our own employers rob from ourselves and take to this other country, which is number one in terms of incorruptibility. And how can we really get this? And don't forget that, we have all these courts, we have all these agents, all these influencers.
Allow us time to answer this as well, sir. We're running out of time. So if
I agree, just to put in perspective into this. But you have all these players. It's not just the external actor alone. It is these local, agents who are part of the problem. How do you deal with those? Now, a solution has been given. Resistance, resist. But Honorable Minister Beruta, now if this foreign actor chooses divide and rule, you resist, and the other one doesn't resist, how possibly can we, bring all these 54 states, how can we galvanize them to resist at the same level so that we can fight off this foreign interference? Finally, this economic fragility, Mr. Kagoro, we have all the natural resources, we are crying foul, there is no funding to the African Union. Where then would the resources come up? Thank you very much. I submit.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with you, Prof. I think there was quite some issues to yes.
Just two things. Let me start with what the good general said about rekindling the Pan-African spirit. When we were students, we were taught history of Pan-African movements, so the education system actually told us about Africa. I now know in many African countries where history is not taught. So when you stop teaching history, then you begin to see that we do not even know what is happening. And I think that one of the things that we must do is to look at our curriculum in our respective institutions of higher learning. It is only in that way that we'll begin to plant the seed of Pan-Africanism, and it is only in that way that we will educate our young people. Indeed, I dare say that if Africa Agenda 2063 and all these initiatives are going to gain traction, it is the younger generation that must, in a manner of speaking, be indoctrinated. And I'm using the word indoctrinated very, very deliberately, so that they can identify with this struggle for Pan-Africanism. And I think that that is very important going forward, so that forums such as this, and you remember earlier, and then I stopped when I said that I hope the meeting on the next week in the Pan-African, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, will not be just pro forma. It will be a meeting at which the heads of states and the Council of Ministers raise critical issues with a clear plan of action, so that the Secretariat has things to cascade to the people for purposes of consumption, so that we can begin to see milestones as we move towards fulfilling the Pan-African dream. I want to stop there so that others may also enrich the debate. Thank you.